Center for the Humanities, and I am beyond thrilled to welcome Jake Blount. You can't hear me? Okay. Let me try. Hello, how's that? Is that any better? Short person thing. Right. How's that, everyone? Okay, thanks for letting me know. So, again, good afternoon. I'm Eve Stern, Director of URI Center for the Humanities, and I am thrilled to welcome Jake Blount to URI today to share both his scholarship and his music. Mr. Blount's visit is part of our year-long series, Re-Envisioning Nature and Environmental Humanities Lecture Series. I'd like to welcome everyone who is here in person or watching the live stream from home or from their offices, and I hope you all will come back and join us at 8 p.m. when Mr. Blount performs live in the Fine Arts Center here at URI. Now I'd like to welcome my colleague, Dr. Hannah Francis, Visiting Assistant Professor in the Africana Studies Department, who will welcome and introduce Mr. Blount.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, who's going to talk to us about the natural imagery present in Black spirituals and his presentation entitled, Go into the Wilderness, Black Spirituals and the Natural Environment. The spiritual is an important American musical tradition developed by enslaved people that continue to be performed by their African American descendants. Our speaker is both a scholar of Black American music as well as an acclaimed musician. This past September, the record, The New Faith, under the Smithsonian Folkways Recordings African American Legacy Series in conjunction with the National Museum of African American History and Culture. The New Faith has been described as a dystopian Afrofuturistic opus that reimagines the spiritual. So please join me in welcoming Jake Blount to URI.
We're having a good day? Cool. Thank you so much to everyone here at URI for having me. This is actually the first time I've been able to present this work in any real way. It has been the underpinning of my artistic practice for the past several years, but typically speaking, folks in my position who are performers don't wind up getting a whole lot of opportunities to explain the in-depth research that underpins a lot of our research. We kind of have to stick to the 101 level for, you know, a YouTube video or a 1-minute TV interview or whatever it may be. And it leaves a lot unsaid. I'm very excited for the opportunity to share this with you. As I said, it's my first time sharing it with anybody. Bear with me. Inevitably, these things seem to fall at the end of a very long tour for me. I got back to Rhode Island at 5:30 a.m. this morning and feeling a lot of ways about being in public right now. So if I say something that does not make any sense, which is likely because there's a great span of time before us and I don't have a great success ratio at the best of times, please feel free to raise your hand and say, what did that mean? Yes, I'm here to give you a presentation that's kind of about the connection to the natural environment that we see in the Black spiritual canon. Obviously, that is a vast body of work, and I worked with a number of different print collections, audio compilations, and different archives to mine material for my most recent release, The New Faith. I'm going to treat this more or less as a mixture of an artist talk and a presentation because I went to do all of this digging with an artist's mindset. Oftentimes I think that can be a different thing than what you have to do if you're a researcher and you have a thesis that you need to prove or a point that you need to make to a skeptical audience. If you are in the position, as I so often am, of representing these traditions on an international stage, I think it can kind of get in the way of you presenting things honestly if you approach it with your own agenda in mind or an argument that you want to prove, instead of looking at the songs, seeing what they have to tell you, and finding ways to embody what you find there. So with all of that said, I'm going to hopefully give you a little window into the things that have underpinned my approach over the past few years, and we'll have some time for questions at the end. As I said though, if you get lost, if I lose you somewhere in the middle, don't hesitate to let me know. I like to start by just giving a sense of how these things are going to go. There's a lot of ground to potentially cover in this presentation. I'm going to give a lot of time for questions at the end because inevitably dealing with the music as a text also necessitates dealing with the context surrounding the music. There's a deep history here, a complicated history here. People have written books on this topic, and I am undertaking an ambitious task in trying to sum it up in the amount of time that I am. So I want to make sure that if there are specific angles you want to hear explored, we get there. But as things stand, I'm going to explain what the New Faith is, explain the concept of that album, explain how the sequel album, which is just beginning, is taking shape based on the research that I'm going to share with you here. I'm going to talk about the way I went about gathering the material. I'm going to name some specific collections that I used, because I know people are often curious about that, and I'm sure your own library has a few that you can dig up. I'm going to talk a little bit about the context that informs how Black people relate to nature, how nature is discussed in our families and in our communities and in these songs from way back in the day. And then we're going to talk about the songs themselves, which I have further broken out into more categories that will become clear when we get to that part of the presentation. The New Faith is an Afrofuturist album, often characterized as dystopian indeed, although I don't necessarily view it that way, often characterized as post-apocalyptic, but I don't view it that way. The premise is that 100 years, 200 years, maybe 300 in the future, we have continued our business as usual approach to dealing with the topic of climate change. Things have gotten pretty bad. The inclement weather, desertification, scarce resources have forced mass human migration, have precipitated global conflict. Things have changed a lot, and because it deals with such a small slice of what's going on at that particular moment, I didn't get too specific about how. So I don't know, but the album depicts a religious ceremony taking place amongst the descendants of Black climate refugees who have fled from the South up to New England in search of arable land, in search of a more stable climate, in search of a place that they're able to make a living for themselves. But they've been confined to a refugee camp on an island off of the coast because America loves some refugee camps. We do that a lot, and particularly when things get rough. So it was a way of kind of taking these spirituals and connecting them to issues of environmental justice, connecting them to issues of social justice in ways that I feel they're all very much connected already. And part of my process is always changing these things in ways that feel still faithful to the cultural context they come out of. But that was the grounding of the first record. As I said, I'm about to start the second record. I can't tell you too much about it because my label would get very mad at me if I did, but it's much more connected to what we're going to talk about today, as opposed to the first record, which really utilized the spirituals as a type of commentary rather than necessarily just as a religious text to tell a story. This second one is much more religious in tone and does more extracting of existing themes and relationships relating to the natural world that already exist within the songs. So a lot of what I'm going to share with you today has been research that I've done preparing for this second chapter rather than the one that's already out. As I said, when I'm approaching these things as an artist, I don't feel that the scholarly lens is always the most appropriate one to take. I think when I'm in the position of representing something to a public that at times doesn't know that much about it, it isn't necessarily the most ethical thing for me to approach it with my own arguments or agenda in mind. Of course, my perspective is going to inform the way this thing takes shape because I am myself. I am going through these archives, these collections with my own mind, searching for things that interest me. So I'm in there, but the general approach that many traditional musicians tend to take is to minimize ourselves and let the songs speak. And the New Faith challenged me on that score because I was asking the songs to speak to something that was not a known phenomenon when the songs were written. And that's its own challenge. But I went through print collections, including these 4 I have here. I went through many, many audio compilations, but for this presentation, I've just drawn on the ones listed up here. And I don't know, maybe this isn't the time to go down the rabbit hole of the experience of going through these old things, of finding all of these buried treasures in all these different places and observing the patterns that emerge in the people who collect the songs. What black folklorists like our Nathaniel Dett, who's up here, were able to uncover that the white folklorists who went collecting the same songs did not find, right? There were songs that were not sung for those scholars who went down to collect those materials. So we have an incomplete record, but we have a vast record, and I approached that record with an open mind, hoping to find things that align with me, but also very aware that if the project fails because of a lack of relevant text, that's also a message from the ancestors. I'm on the wrong track. We have a complicated history with nature. I think probably many black folks in here know that outdoorsiness is not necessarily considered a mainstream value in our culture a lot of the time. I think that's dependent on geography. I think it's dependent on generation. But we have a complicated relationship with the natural environment to untangle. And there are a lot of people who've written about that in greater depth than I have the time to go into right now. But when we look back at these spirituals, when you look at the way that the land is often portrayed in the context of our historical experience, things that have happened to us, you wind up with songs like Many Thousand Go, right? This is from that Allen collection from the 1800s, but it's in all of my collections because everyone sang it. And how is nature present? How is our relationship to the land present? It's present in the context of enslavement, right? Our relationship to agriculture, to working the land, to developing food and resources in partnership with the land is through a carceral experience. It wasn't something they did voluntarily. And that same theme continues through a lot of other topic areas that you wind up encountering, right? When we talk about black folk music writ large, whether it's spirituals, whether it's blues, string band music, whatever you want to talk about, the root of all of that is on slave ships. When people were taken from Africa and put on those boats, one of the ways that their captors kept them alive through the Middle Passage was to take them up on deck and make them dance in order to keep their physical health in a better place, not in a good place, and to keep their emotional health in a better place, not a good place. They were dancing a mixture of African and European dances to a mixture of African and European instruments. If you want to know more about that part of the history, I strongly recommend a book called Sinful Tunes and Spirituals from Dina Epstein. It's a wonderful, very detailed book that goes into great depth about all of it. But as a musician, studying this old thing, you know, the way that this tradition took shape, it becomes quite clear that the ocean is the root of it. Our culture is indigenous to the Atlantic Ocean. We became a discrete people rather than a collection of African people on the ocean, on those boats, and in the Caribbean, right, where our very first cultural forms unique to black people in the Americas, as opposed to holdovers from Africa, like the banjo, like the kalenda, come into being. The ocean is deeply important to our experience as a people. Many of the songs that I have gathered have come from folks who were living on, say, the Georgia or South Carolina Sea Islands, or in Tidewater, Virginia, where my family is from. They were living right next to the ocean. They were working the ocean for their livelihoods. I have found one song that talks about the ocean. And it talks about the ocean alongside graveyards and hell as a place that will erupt with the resurrected dead on Judgment Day. There is a very complicated relationship to all of this, and it bears thinking about as we go forward, that there are going to be certain pieces that are missing like that because it wasn't something people wanted to dwell on, or perhaps it wasn't something that they wanted to sing about for the white people who were down there collecting the songs. There are a lot of questions that we have to ask. Furthermore, there are other more concrete questions to be encountered, right? When we talk about land in Black history, oftentimes it winds up being a dialogue about landlessness, right? About people being forced to work land that was not theirs, about that labor being used, being stolen by people who did own the land. We don't talk about the ascendant Black middle class of the late 1800s and early 1900s that was quite deliberately and violently squished in this country, right? There is a legacy of Black people owning their own land, working their own land, and building vibrant communities in relationship to the land, and we don't talk about it. That history is hidden from us. And a large part of what I'm trying to do in this project is manifest that relationship many generations down the line and uncover the legacy of that long relationship to the ocean, to the rivers, to the fields. I broke the songs up into a few different categories, as I said. These are overlapping categories, and they're not all the categories that are there. There are some songs that I found that are quite clearly about nature that, one, are very specifically modern and don't necessarily match up, right? I was going through a collection preparing for this presentation, and I found an anti-Soviet space race spiritual called Russia, Leave God's Moon Alone, which I love. There's another one, I'm gonna get her name wrong, because as far as anyone knows, she's not a real person. There's like, rain keeps falling on Hannah Johnson's head or something. It's like specifically about this one individual woman getting rained on, and there's some religious significance to her getting rained on, but because nobody knows who she is and the song isn't clear, we don't know. Those are weird examples, but there are some spots going through this body of songs where you will encounter text that no longer makes sense. And I have restricted this to things that I can understand, because I don't feel that comfortable reading meaning into things that I don't. But I want to acknowledge this is not going to be the full list. These are the things that made sense to me. I want to start with valley songs. I find the valley really interesting as a concept that emerges. I know I'm probably not the only one who the first prayer that I was taught was, though I walk in the valley of the shadow of death, right? This is a very common concept, something that gets evoked quite often, but it takes very different shapes in the context of the spirituals, and that I haven't really heard the valley of the shadow of death mentioned. But they talk about the lonesome valley, or the valley, and this collection is really great, Slave Songs of the United States. If anybody is interested in this stuff, not only do they include the songs, but they include a great deal of detail about what the text of the songs meant in the context that it was collected, which is quite rare for things from that era. So, right beneath this song, The Lonesome Valley, there's this whole paragraph about how this is the anxious seat in the congregation, that a young woman would tie a piece of cloth around her head and be in preparation for baptism and wouldn't take that piece of cloth off until she'd been baptized, and that she was in the valley or in the lonesome valley until the baptism had taken place. There isn't a great deal of detail about the context of her needing that baptism, right? I don't know whether this is a baptism of something having gone wrong and that person needing to be cleansed, or someone who simply has not been baptized and needs to undergo that. I do know that it was a woman and not a girl, so this is clearly an adult, someone who is seeking out baptism as an adult, whether because they never received it, whether because they need healing from something and that was how. The valley is a place that you go through in your journey toward absolution. There's a second interpretation of the valley that appears in some other songs. This is one that I'm going to play for you called Lights in the Valley. It's Joe and Odell Thompson, who were a black banjo fiddle duo from Mebane, North Carolina. I don't expect anybody here to have heard of Joe and Odell Thompson necessarily, but you may have heard of some of their students. Joe Thompson was the only black fiddle player out of that long, intact black fiddle tradition to survive into the 21st century. And he taught 3 students who went on to become a band called the Carolina Chocolate Drops, Rhiannon Giddens, Justin Robinson, and Dom Flemons. So I learned from them in large part. I feel like Joe is my musical granddad in some ways. So I really like his music, and this is one of the very first songs that Rhiannon taught me. It's called Lights in the Valley. Okay, something's going on there. James, do we know if that might be something in the connection, or I'm not really sure. Why don't we try plan B here, because that's not working. Okay, I guess we're just gonna get scrambled eggs when I try to play songs. Yeah, I don't know. The Wi-Fi thinks it's okay. I don't know. Can I try pulling it up on this computer real quick? Does that work? Okay. Forgive me the technical delay. We're here. Okay. That be enough of that. Let's see. Did I do it right? I don't think I did it right. James. James, everybody. Oh.
Check your.
There we go. Thank you. Oh. Okay. All right. So this vision of the valley is decidedly different. Instead of it being this kind of dark place that you go into in your search for the divine, it sounds like heaven, or maybe the Garden of Eden. Those two things overlap quite strongly in the context of the spirituals. I'll talk about that on a later slide. But the valley, in the context of that song and in some other songs like it, represents closeness to God, closeness to the family, right? You got friends in the valley, outshine the sun. It's a very warm image. It's a very promising image. So the valley isn't always a bad thing. And maybe we're thinking about the valley in that context as rich agricultural ground, as a place with a more mild climate, all sorts of things that become associated with heaven, with the divine, with the Garden of Eden in other songs. All right, I'm going. I don't want that. It's not going to work. Okay. I will have to pull up another video here shortly, but before I do that, storms are interesting. There are some songs out there that kind of frame storms as a thing you have to get through as a divine trial, time of tribulation, etc. Most of those that I have found are more modern. And when I look at the older songs, typically when storms appear, storms represent kind of a terrifying aspect of God or of Jesus, depending on the song. In this particular one, Over the Crossing, you can see that God sends a storm in order to signal his followers through thunder that the time has come to pass on to heaven and to literally blow them away and bring them up to heaven with the force of the winds. It's a strong image, and I'm going to play you one called The Angels Done Bowed Down that's off of my previous album, Spider Tales, which kind of broke this ground for me initially. And I give you my recording not because I think that this is the place to do that necessarily, but it's the only audio recording that exists of the song. There is an operatic setting of the song, but it doesn't keep any of the melody, it doesn't keep any of the rhythm, so it's kind of this same lyric set to new music. But I got this out of a archive that I only have digital copies of, so I wasn't able to go pull the sheet music for you. But it's a wonderful one. It was collected by John Wesley Work III, who was a black collector of black folk songs, which was a sadly rare thing back in the day. And as I mentioned, he and R. Nathaniel Dett managed to get some songs that are of a type I have not seen in any of the collections by white folklorists. I could not prove to you definitively that there was a class of songs of terrifying, bloodthirsty God that did not get sung for white people, but circumstantial evidence suggests to me that that may have been the case. There's a whole section in the R. Nathaniel Dett collection called Hymns of Admonition that is just admonishment. We'll go into that later, but it's quite graphic and intense in some places, and The Angels Done Bowed Down is another example of that. So I'm going to try and switch over here.
To ride, the angels come bow down, the angels come bow down, the angels come bow down. Oh yes, my Lord. Go down, angels, to the flood, blow out the sun, turn the moon into blood. Come back, angels, walk the door. The time that's been will be no more. The angels done bow down. The angels done bow down. The angels done bow down. Oh yes, my Lord.
So that song is also emblematic of this storm, right? Jesus rises on a pillar of cloud with a sword at his side, preparing to ride to battle on the empty air. All of which, I sometimes wind up a little bit confused when I listen to these spirituals because they seem to be jumping through time in the Bible in ways that don't necessarily make a whole lot of sense to me. And you wonder sometimes if this is an older story that is being told through biblical language, where, you know, Jesus did not rise upon his crucifixion and immediately purge the earth. That's not how it goes. There's like a few thousand years of space in there. And other songs reflect that. You notice that there's kind of a bit of natural imagery in this song, right? The angels are hanging their harps on willow trees to sing to him to ease his passage. And when he dies, the storm whips up, he rises on the clouds and rides to war. It's a mighty manifestation of divine power, and one that is quite specifically hostile to human life, even in situations like, or the crossing here, where God is reaching out to believers. They're still being blown away and killed by it. Maybe reflective of how storms appeared to folks at that time who were living, you know, on islands in the south and probably got hit by some bad hurricanes, probably experienced some wild floods. I've never had that particular problem before, I have to say. All right. One of the other interesting things that crops up are times of day. They all have quite specific connotations. There are definitely moments where the evening, the setting of the sun, represents either kind of the end of time, things wrapping up at the end of our collective day, and Judgment Day then following. There are moments where nightfall coming represents the singer or the protagonist of the song, if not the literal singer, dying. But far more common are morning songs, some of which are quite obvious. Of course, Easter morning, right? There's, you know, the resurrection that happens in the morning. A lot of them are about that. So Happy Morning is one example of that. Quite clearly just an Easter song. And then there's also this other thread that I find interesting that continues into some modern gospel music, where the morning specifically is the time of death, that people will, in the morning, one bright morning, one cold morning, either wake up in heaven or otherwise die and go to heaven. It's the time of dying, it's the time of ascension to heaven, it's a transitional time of day. Interesting to think about for me. I don't necessarily think of morning as the death hour, and definitely suggests that our narrative around that, the imagery that we associate with death and dying, has changed significantly in the time since these songs were first made. I'm a big fan of what I call star songs. I call them star songs, but I also include the moon in that category. Celestial bodies songs does not roll off the tongue quite as easily. But they do play quite a big role, in a similar way to storms, in fact. There are a lot of songs that revolve around stars falling, about the moon turning into blood, which of course is actually a thing that happens in the book of Revelation. So there's biblical content for the blood moon image. but some of the other stuff that appears doesn't seem that way to me. It seems to be something that was elaborated and added in these songs particularly, which I find pretty exciting. I always like to see, a new perspective being added to this stuff, and something unique emerging as a result. So I've included the Day of Judgment here, but I know a few songs that fall into this category. There's one that's just called Stars Begin to Fall. There are several of them, and they all revolve around celestial bodies transforming, falling out of the sky, and that being the sign that the end has come, that these are the signals that God gives us, is the celestial bodies, which I find interesting. It's almost a communication point of some kind. By the same token, light oftentimes is represented as an act of generosity from God. There are a bunch of songs that kind of come from a place of gratitude for the beauty of the world around us. I consider Once There Was No Sun to be one of these. I'm going to have to pull that up separately also. But it's a song that meditates on the time before the creation of the sun and the moon and expresses this deep gratitude that that time is over, that the sun and moon have been made. And you find, going through a lot of other songs, and I would say that the morning songs are part of this, right? That light and God are really strongly linked together. There is specifically something about sunlight and God, about light in general, and that oftentimes they wind up giving a climate to divine interactions, to divine places, and we'll get to that in a little bit. I want to play Once There Was No Sun for you now. I'm just going to do another quick switcheroo here. Oh my. We can listen to my whole album. That sounds like torture. I played a cruise ship festival on this last tour, and on one of the stages, they just played a ton of my song. That's how I put it, me. They played a ton of my songs while I was getting ready to go on stage. I was like, well, not only do I hate listening to myself, now everyone's heard everything. I don't know what point there is. So this is Bessie Jones. Are people here familiar with Bessie Jones? Is this a known name? I see some heads nodding, some heads shaking. Bessie Jones sang with a group called the Georgia Sea Island Singers. They were a Gullah Geechee singing group from the Georgia Sea Islands. She herself was not Gullah. She was not from the Georgia Sea Islands. She was from Alabama. She moved there. She married into the community, and she was just a fantastic interpreter of these music, a fantastic leader. There's a really great disc out called Gettin' Union that has dozens of these songs, and excitingly, she's not leading all of them. She leads a lot of them, and they're wonderful. But we also get to hear other members of the ensemble take charge. So there are two versions of Once There Was No Sun on this CD. And this is the larger group setting.
In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. The earth was without form, void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the water. And God said, let there be light. And there was light.
Once there was no sun, Lord, it was there was no sun. Oh, once there was no sun, Lord, I heard the angels singing. Oh, once there was no moon, oh, once there was no moon. Yeah, once there was no moon, Lord, I heard the angels singing. Oh, do Lord go down, do Lord go down, do sing that, do Lord go down. Yeah, I heard the angels singing. Oh, once there was no light, Lord, once there was no light. Yeah, once there was no light, Lord, I heard the angels singing. Oh, do Lord go down. Yeah, do Lord go down. Singing that, do Lord wasn't no light. Lord, what there wasn't no light. They said what there wasn't no light. Lord, I heard angels singing. Oh, do the Lord go down? Do the Lord go down? Oh, Lord, now do the Lord go down? Well, I heard angels singing. God brought on the light. Oh, yeah, God brought on the light. I know that God brought on the light. You know, I heard angels singing. Oh, I am so glad. I am so glad they were singing that. I am so glad. Lord, I heard angels singing. And God, He made man. Yeah, God, He made man. God knows that God, He made man. Lord, and I heard angels singing. Oh, do Lord go down? Do Lord go down? Everyone singing that. Do Lord go down? Well, I heard angels singing.
That's like one of the best recordings of all time, I have to say. I'm a big fan, as you know. If you have looked up my work, probably my version of that song is the one that you saw. It's one of my very favorites, and definitely falls into that category of celestial bodies being the symbol of the divine and of the state of our relationship with the divine. There are also similar narratives surrounding the planet that we live on, and this is some of the most fertile ground for me, and the reason that I'm exploring this, right? I'm trying to think of the ways in which we relate to nature, and over again, listening to these old songs, you hear little hints of almost treating connection to the earth and connection to God as synonymous. And I've picked one song here called Hard Trials that kind of showcases that. You see the foxes have holes in the ground, and the birds their nests in the air, and everything has a hiding place, but we poor sinners have none. That, of course, might be similar or familiar to some of you if you've heard a song called No Hiding Place. There's no hiding place down here. You run to the sea cry out. You run to the mountain cries. Turn to the rock to hide your face. The rock cried out, no hiding place. There's no hiding place down here. So there are a lot of songs that are about the earth refusing to shelter sinners, that if you are not acting right, the earth will reject you. And what I love about this particular song is that it gives examples of the opposite happening in nature, that there are these beings that are living in harmony with the earth, that are being true to their purpose, and are welcomed by the earth as a result, whereas sinners are cast out, are denied shelter, have nowhere to go. We have a robust contrary thread of songs that are about the great bounty of nature for people who are seeking God, who are seeking the divine, that in the case of, say, this song, I'm Going Home, in the case of the song Go in the Wilderness, which I titled this workshop after, although I wound up not including it here, the wilderness is the place where the divine dwells, that you go into the wilderness. And of course, there's a John the Baptist thing going on here, right? And in some cases, there's one song called I Wonder Where Is My Brother Gone that talks about your brother going to the wilderness, wonder where is my brother John. I don't think that it's just about the brother John, but that's a whole other thread. That's a very narrow rabbit hole we could go down. I think in these cases, it's interesting to see how wilderness emerges where John is not mentioned, and the fact that the wilderness is a place that the faithful go to find free grace, where their Father preaches. And some scholars, some authors who talk about this have mentioned in that context, the heritage of enslaved people having to go out into the woods to have religious services at certain times in our history, right? I've talked to my uncle about this, who's a minister, and he brings up the covert religious gatherings that enslaved people had to hold. And the woods were one place where that happened. I can't tell you that that's exactly what's happening here. I don't know what was in this person's heart when they sang the song, but it's interesting to me that in these songs that can sometimes be so much about seeking God in a place apart from the earth, right? That we're going to heaven, that everything divine is somewhere else where we are not, and all we have to hope for is going to that place. There's also this thread of you can find him here if you go to the wilderness and look. By far the largest category are water songs, and I put these at the end because they often include elements of the other things that I've talked about, right? Storms have water implications, celestial bodies have water implications. There's an obvious connection here to other diasporic religions for folks who study that, right? Many of the prominent orishas are water-based deities. We talk about Olokun, Oshun. There are a lot of people who are gods that are associated with oceans, with rivers, that occupy a position of great prominence in those faiths. Clearly, we don't have a whole lot of record of pre-Christian faiths as they were practiced here in the United States. We know that it happened. We know that many holdovers from those times exist, but it's not really in plain text in these collections. But I do find the resonance striking here. One of the interesting things about this is that we're very specific about what water we're talking about. Like I said, a lot of these songs are coming from people who live next to the ocean, and they're all talking about rivers, which I find really interesting. Again, maybe suggests that there was some hesitancy to discuss the ocean because of the relationship that we had with it. Being on the ocean can have, even today, pretty strong spiritual and emotional implications for Black people. If you go read like some Black travel blogs of people who've done like a transatlantic passage on a boat, it's a very intense experience for a lot of people. And I do believe that that may be part of why these people who were all next to the ocean never wanted to sing about it. But what we do have are a lot of songs that are about water in general, that are about rivers. We have some songs that mention ships and sailing, which seems like it implies an ocean, but probably could maybe be a river or a lake, depending on where they were. Water has innate healing and purifying properties in these songs that are not overly elaborated upon, but are quite intuitive. Of course, we think about river baptism as being something that was happening during this time and today. Baptism in general is using water to purify people in the name of God. So there is a connection there that doesn't necessarily take much explaining. But what's interesting to me is that water seems to be the joining point in a lot of these songs between the divine and the earthly, where you can go into the wilderness, perhaps, and find the divine there, but we have songs that literally talk about Jesus waiting for people on the edge of the water. Which of course conjures water walking. Perhaps this is about a specific story from the Bible. But we also have songs like Let God's Saints Come In. This one like blew my mind when I found it, because it's this invocation of angels to come down and fill the water with divine spirits. The water is a house for non-angel and non-God spirits of unknown definition, which I find fascinating. The angels and the saints are two separate things in this song, and the water is able to house those spirits. Curiously, this is a very different manifestation of the power of the divine in water than we find in a lot of the other songs, right? I've included Healin' Waters here, which is a more typical example of what you might find, which is about seeking healing from water. I don't know how well you can see the words, but it's healing waters done move, healing waters done move, what's the matter now, come to Jesus. I think a lot of people are probably familiar with Wade in the Water, perhaps Take Me to the Water. There are a lot of songs about going to water to be cleansed, to be healed. Let God's Saints Come In is interesting because it's invoking the angels, it's filling the water with spirits, but it's a song about Egypt. The implication here is that these spirits are parting the Red Sea and then drowning the Pharaoh, which is really interesting to me. This is a very different manifestation of the divine through water than we see in the rest of the songs. It's more in line, perhaps, with the depictions that we see of the ocean. I referenced this song earlier, but I put a little snippet down here at the bottom of the slide from that R. Nathaniel Dett collection that did manage to capture some rather dark and intense songs. This is from a song called Live Humble that the Georgia Sea Island Singers also sang. There's a great deal of crossover between the repertoire of Gullah Geechee people and of Tidewater, Virginia people, which I find really interesting. I've been asking a lot of people if they know why. Nobody knows why. So, I don't know. Project for my next album, maybe. But I find this song really interesting because it has this whole section that's just annotated recitando rapido. And it's just people speaking over, it gives you one note that's just a whole note, and it says live humble under it. So I'm assuming that that means people are humming or just singing or just repeating that word as a refrain underneath. But it's a rap section. There's a rap section in the spiritual collected in 1927 from the Hampton Institute. Like, it's wild to me. And the way the ocean manifests here, you see tombstones cracking, graves busting, hell and the seas going to give up their dead. It's a burying ground and a place full of bodies. And I find that really striking, both because of the history of our ancestors who jumped over the sides of ships. There is quite a large body of modern Black art and Black song. I think of Drexcia as being a really prominent example of this, that engages with the seafloor as a resting place for Black ancestors. But I haven't heard it in a song this old before. It's really striking to me. The other curious detail here, or nuance, in the way that we read these songs, take, for instance, Deep River here, which is much calmer. Deep river, I want to cross over in a calm time. I want to meet death smiling. This is someone who is crossing the river to the afterlife. Water is the boundary between life and death, which also appears in some African religions. Curiously, in the context of American songs, and particularly songs of people who were enslaved, the river is often assumed to symbolize either the literal Ohio River or the boundary between enslavement and freedom. When you read these songs, I tend to kind of take them at face value sometimes and go, oh, this is someone talking about dying. I think Deep River probably is someone talking about dying, but there are all other types of songs like Roll Jordan Roll, all sorts of things about I'm crossing the River Jordan. I think those probably do have to do with crossing the Ohio River, with making your way north. There is a great deal of metaphorical text that's about the world around us also buried in the songs, and that comes through. But water by far is the most powerful element that you find when you're looking into these old spirituals. That is the last slide I have of songs for you. But I think this has been a really impactful project for me. I grew up very close to a set of grandparents who were farmers and grew up working the land. And my father grew up working that farm. I have spent cumulatively years of my life on that farm. I lived there for part of the pandemic. And I love it, and I feel very close to and embraced by that land. I characterized it at one point as feeling like when I stepped outside, the ground reached back up to greet me. And I've never felt that anywhere else. And one of the things that is so meaningful to me, looking through these old collections, is hearing the ways that that manifested for people who came before me and people who had very different relationships with the land. Because I'm lucky in that my grandfather owned that land, right? Most of the Black people of his generation weren't able to do that. He was both smart and lucky to be in that position. But it speaks volumes to me that even people who did not own that land, people who did not choose to be on that land, would equate the land with divine providence, with divine generosity, that they viewed it as an opportunity and a gift to occupy that space. And that there's this implicit message of doing right by God, also meaning doing right by the earth. There's a wonderful message in there for all of us, something that I'm thinking about quite a bit as I continue with my work in this area. And I guess it's questions time. So anybody has questions? This is the moment. worked right when you were putting it down.
So,
There you go.
okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, if you have a question, raise your hand, and I'll come around and bring you the microphone.
You mentioned a book in the beginning that I thought I would be interested in reading, but I didn't catch the title. Do you remember what it was?
I do. Sinful Tunes and Spirituals.
Sinful Tunes?
Yes. Yes. Sinful Tunes and Spirituals, Black Folk Music to the Civil War, by Dina J. Epstein. Black Folk Music to the Civil War.
Anyone else?
Thank you so much for this. This is wonderful. I'm interested in hearing more from you about your relationship with the different folklorists. And yeah, I'm so interested to learn more about our Nathaniel Dett. But then also just as an artist, when you head into these archives and you have to deal with these various folklorists as, I don't know what the right metaphor is, conduit or access point, right, for these other artists in other times. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about that process and how you deal with these people in between.
I would love to do that. So, one of the complicated things about digging through all these archives is that the people who went out and recorded these songs had their own ideas and agendas a lot of the time. And while I'm very excited about, say, our Nathaniel Dett, who was a Black Canadian composer who was down there working at the Hampton Institute when he collected these songs and put the book together, or John Wesley Work III, who was a Black collector of Black folk songs and spirituals affiliated with Fisk University, but published a whole book of them as his master's thesis at Columbia, which is where The Angels Done Bowed Down came from. They're really incredible and uncovered a lot of really wonderful songs. And all of the folklorists that I have worked with have really uncovered some gems. So everything that I say comes with a layer of I'm grateful for the fact that you were there and that you did this, but a lot of them were not trained. There really wasn't a field of folklore at the time that a lot of these people were growing up and were beginning their collecting practice. And even when the field of folklore came into existence, it had to go through some iterations before it figured stuff out. So when we talk about, say, Alan Lomax, who there are some songs from in here. I drew on American Ballads and Folk Songs, which is published by John and Alan Lomax. It was written by them. They were not trained in any way, did a lot of things that would not pass an IRB assessment today that are unethical. And working in that archive is complicated because on one hand I love the songs, but on the other hand I have to be aware, especially when it comes to secular music, because they did a lot of that as well. Alan Lomax kind of went out with the idea of like, I want to find like real Black music, which meant Black music that was like not diluted in some way by white traditions, which is a very funny reversal from folklorists like 1 century prior, who people we would now call folklorists, who were going down and trying to search out like intact Elizabethan traditions in the Appalachian Mountains that had not been tainted by Black people. But like, there's like this weird purity thing that happens on both sides of the coin. And what that meant for Alan Lomax was that when he went looking for Black folk songs, he was like, where are the blackest Black people? In jail. And just went and recorded a bunch of people who were in jail, which, like, I think it is probably the role of a folklorist to prioritize collecting from the most marginalized voices in society because they're the ones who most need preserving, or at least likely to be able to preserve themselves. But, as I say, at the time, especially when John Lomax was working, Alan was still young at this point, but there was a Black middle class that really didn't get recorded. There are whole geographic regions of this country that they kind of overlooked because they were really focused on people who were incarcerated in the Deep South. Now, there are a lot of folklorists other than Alan Lomax who did maybe a better job, certainly a different job. Corlander up here did a really wonderful job going down into the South, picking up some really wonderful songs in both audio and print format. So there is a book that you can get called Negro Folk Music USA, but there are also compilation discs of those recordings that are really beautiful. But yes, we always have to be mindful of the fact that they had prejudices, and they went oftentimes seeking to reinforce ideas they had when they went in, which is part of why I'm so resistant to going in with my own agenda when I look at their archive, because I feel like I'm going to double the damage. But I think in reading all things, it's always a good idea to go in with a grain of salt. And even some of the really wonderful, comprehensive modern texts that have come out about the Black folk tradition, less so spirituals in my experience, but especially the string band stuff that I often wind up reading about and presenting on, is pretty racist and pretty essentialist and pretty disrespectful of the subjects of the work. And the field has still some way to go in correcting that. I think a lot of the people being trained today certainly know better, but there's a whole lot of questioning and interrogation of what we have available to us in archives and in the existing literature that needs to happen. So I always try to have those questions foremost in my mind when I'm looking through these books. Thanks for the question.
I think I might have read in Songlines magazine that you didn't grow up in a religious household. So I'm curious how you came to these songs and how it changed religious, spiritually, your own outlook to the world, the universe, and also what brought you to live in Rhode Island?
Good questions, all good questions. So I grew up in, I would characterize it as more of a mixed religious household in that my mom simply has never cared. And my dad does, but he worked on Sunday. So I didn't grow up going to church with them, but I went with my grandparents when I went down south. So I grew up in proximity to the Black church, but not as a consistent member of it. And that definitely left me feeling some ambiguity in my relationship to it. And I think as a member of the LGBTQ community, I feel often rejected and disrespected by that church, right? My grandmother passed last summer. I went down to the church service, heard some great music, had a wonderful time, and the pastor would not shake my hand while I was walking out behind my grandmother's coffin, right? There's a strong antipathy there on both sides, because I'm not Christian. I'm not going to turn the other cheek about that. That's crazy. You don't treat people like that. And certainly I had to jump through some hoops to figure out what my relationship was with these songs, because I love the songs, I love what they represent, and for Black people, because our ancestors were not legally permitted to learn to read and write for a really long time, because literacy has continued to be a problem due to the underfunding of public schools and redlining and all of these interconnected problems, we don't have the literature, the record, to show us what our ancestors thought and felt. Even the ones who could write things down for us couldn't write down exactly what they thought, because it was also being read by white people. And if they said the wrong thing, not only would their work have been erased, they probably would have been killed for it. These songs are the most intact record we have of what our ancestors were thinking and feeling at the time. And that's incredibly meaningful to me on its own. So I've always felt really connected to these songs, even in a purely secular sense, because all of the embedded principles, even if they're expressed through Christian doctrine, are messages from my ancestors about who they wanted me to be and how they wanted me to live and comport myself. And I think that can have its own meaning independent of the religious doctrine. I think part of the reason why my first project really significantly engaging with this material is like an Afrofuturist sci-fi thing is because I had to invent a completely new context for the songs to justify my connection to them, because I don't feel like I can be attached in the place where they currently exist, which is sad to me, but also I love that the possibility exists and that there are people who have paved the way for that kind of experimentation before, like Sun Ra or Janelle Monáe or whoever, these Afrofuturist musicians who have come from a place of feeling not embraced or not belonging and found or invented an environment that suited them through speculative fiction in their music. I moved to Rhode Island because DC got way too expensive, and I needed to go somewhere that was cheaper but still cool. And I had some friends here, so I came and visited, and then I moved, and then coronavirus happened a month later, so I don't know anybody. So, hi, new friends. Come for dinner. Yeah, okay. I thought I saw a hand, but I think I did not see a hand.
I'm curious whether you detected carryovers of African spiritual traditions in the music that were either coded or literal in contradistinction to the Christian version of spirituality.
I think things that I tend to notice looking back at these songs, and of course I say this as someone who is not like, you know, there are people whose whole job it is to like study the Bible and study the African religions and figure out where those two things are intersecting, and I'm not one of them. So I've read books by them, but I don't think that I'm the most qualified to perform that analysis. What I see happening in the songs and in the musical practice are instances of syncretism. So I don't so much hear songs happening that are explicitly non-Christian, but songs that don't necessarily make sense when you put them up against Christian theology. There's a song that I put on the New Faith called Death Have Mercy, for example, that usually gets characterized as a spiritual, but from my perspective, it doesn't really make sense to frame it that way, right? This is a song where the singer, the character of the song, is in the process of dying and is speaking to death. The only entity present in the song is death as like a discrete incarnate being. And the interaction with death is really sensual. It's like, if I was a flower in my bloom, what made death cut me down so soon? Cold icy hands all over me, close your eyes and stretch your limbs. It's like really sexual in the way it talks about a death god. And I just am, it doesn't square to me. So I'm of the opinion that there are some songs that have been subsumed into the spiritual repertoire and people just assume that it's a Christian lens, and then it gets kind of eaten by that. But maybe it was meant to be something else before. It's a strange thing to think about. I think that people tend to overlook the possibility due to this misconception, often reflected in some of the folklorist work, that Africa is very far removed from us in time. That, for example, there's this book called African Banjo Echoes in Appalachia, which I love in many ways, but it introduces one of my favorite banjo players by saying he seemed seasoned, shamanic, and old enough to have come from Africa, when there were like still people being brought from Africa when he was born. Not legally, of course, right? There, you know, the importation laws did go into effect at a certain point and we stopped having legal international inflow. But that being said, there has been constant travel between those two places artistically and spiritually. And I do feel that it does come through. Musically, I think it's quite clear, right? There are things happening in these services that don't happen in white church services, and some things that were not allowed, right? People had to be specifically forbidden from dancing in church at the beginning when they decided they were going to Christianize the slaves, because in Africa, you dance when you're doing a religious ritual. And so much of the scholarship that we have about these early traditions doesn't necessarily take into the account the way those two things crossed over for people. So say Sinful Tunes and Spirituals, which I recommended before, doesn't really go into a great deal about the spiritual underpinnings of whatever musical practice was happening, partially because we don't have concrete evidence, right? If you're working off of text-based sources from the time, they might not be that clear because the white person writing it down might not have known. Those were things that had to be done in secret. But there's a really wonderful scholar, author named Christina Gaddy, who just published a book called Well of Souls that is all about the spiritual significance of especially the banjo, but also some of the dances that went along with it. And really takes a holistic approach, thinking about the significance that music and dance had in African traditions and the ways that those might have carried over in various things people were doing here, including early banjo playing, including the kalinda. So we have a lot of questions that we are still answering. I was talking yesterday to a really amazing scholar and journalist named Mark Lamont Hill, who some of you might know of, and said in that conversation that I feel part of my role and the role of my generation of people is not only to continue these songs, to continue the tradition, to carry the tradition forward, but also to ask questions and restore parts of the tradition that have been deliberately hidden from us. It's not enough to inherit an incomplete record and say that's what we have, when we have the ability to make educated guesses and fill in between the lines. So, very good question. Sorry I don't have a clearer answer for you, but I think that's kind of the work that needs doing. It's exactly the right question to ask.
Hi. I was wondering if you could, if there was any written analysis, like resources I could read more, oh man, the words, questions that are being answered. I was wondering if there's more writing that might answer some of these questions. Where could I look to find out more information about this kind of analysis?
Totally. So I have not found other literature that deals in any great depth with what I have just discussed with you. That doesn't mean it's not there, because I'm not institutionally affiliated right now. I don't have a library to go search in, and I don't have a JSTOR account. So there could be things out there that like Google is not showing me. That being said, there are wonderful books being written. I mentioned Well of Souls just now, which I would say is one that's not necessarily about spirituals, but is about the spiritual in the same times that these songs were being created and were first being handed down. And a lot of the collections that I referenced in the presentation, which, let me get that back up. A lot of these, particularly the Corlander book, has a whole section of analysis accompanying the songs. So by the time you get to the actual song collection, you've had to read a whole thing about what the songs mean. I do think that there are gaps. I think that there's a need at that time to really focus on the concrete metaphors. So Corlander is someone, for example, who emphasized that crossing the River Jordan might have been crossing to freedom. But I don't think that's a shortfall. I think it's just where he's focused. So I think there's good stuff in a lot of those books, where, like I said, that Slave Songs of the United States has a lot of great stuff buried in footnotes, which is a little bit frustrating, but it's there. And yeah, let's talk after. There are more things. But I would like to know more about what specifically you want to know about.
And that was the last question. Thank you all for coming. And I want to remind you that there is a concert at 8 p.m. in the Fine Arts Center. It's in person only.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you. No, I don't, yeah.